Have you ever been in a place where it felt safer for others to approve of you than to actually know you? A place where the welcome felt warm until you stopped performing or let an honest question or vulnerable part of yourself be seen. Today's story, Theseus' sixth and final encounter on his road from Troezen to Athena, offers a picture of that kind of belonging. A belonging that is contingent on you being what someone else wants you to be in order to fit in. There's a word for this kind of pressure that we feel: coercion. Coercive spaces never announce their true intentions up front. They use all sorts of pressure tactics to shape those who cross their thresholds into their own image. From the outside, they borrow the language of care and seem to offer a place of belonging and safety. But once you're inside, it often takes a while for you to realize the price you're going to be asked to pay. In today's part of Theseus' myth, our hero finally reaches the borders of Attica, exhausted, 5 labors behind him, and finds a house at the crossroads. There's a fire, a meal, and a bed. But there's also a catch. A stay at an inn like this could cost our hero his feet. And in our own lives, coercive belonging can cost us our ability to move forward on our own roads too. In this episode, we'll follow Theseus into that last house on the road, and then we'll place a counter image beside it. Another crossing, another kind of host, and a man who learns that the self he was made to believe was not enough was carrying something far greater than he knew. My name is Dimitri, and welcome to the Inward Sea. Hello, and thank you for joining me. If this is your first time here at the Inward Sea, I'm glad you found your way to the shore. Welcome. The Inward Sea is a podcast in which we use the ancient maps of myth and folklore alongside the navigational tools of depth psychology to explore and chart the complex and often turbulent waters of the inner life. This is the 6th installment in a series following the hero Theseus on his journey from Troezen to Athena. We aren't looking at him as a role model or as a vehicle for moral instruction. We're looking at him as a function of the human psyche, the part of each of us that brings what we don't yet fully know about ourselves into the light of consciousness and then helps us integrate it. This episode is longer than usual. It touches something deeply personal, but also painfully widespread right now. The ache for belonging, and the subtle ways coercion can ride in on its back. I want to take you on an exploration of the mechanics of high-control environments, how they, like the character Theseus encounters in today's myth, recruit our hopes, reshape our inner world, and slowly rewrite our sense of self, often without us noticing until much later. I could have trimmed this into something more shareable on social media. Instead, I've kept it long to honor my own path, and because I suspect that many, if not most of us, have experienced what today's episode centers around. I want to make sure that these ideas have the space that they need to breathe. As always, I hope you'll find nourishment here, and perhaps the recognition that if you have been through something like this, or are in it right now, you're not broken, and you're not alone. Before we walk through the door of this final encounter on the road, we need to return for a moment to a topic we discussed in the last episode, James Hillman's Acorn theory. If you want to explore this in more depth, I've linked the transcript to the previous episode in the show notes. But the essence is this. Each of us is born with a specific soul image, a unique calling that is already complete within us. It's close to what Plato describes as the daimon, an intermediary spirit or guiding voice bridging the gap between the human and the divine. Even when we feel confused or take a wrong turn on the paths of our lives, the acorn, this soul image or daimon, holds true. It contains the blueprint of our true stature. Hillman challenges the medical model that views symptoms only as things that need to be cured or eradicated. He argues that what we call symptoms, our quirks, obsessions, and deviations, can be signposts pointing towards our specific fate or calling, the quiet voice of our daimon, trying to make itself heard amid the noise of life. Returning to the image of the acorn. Oak trees grow from acorns without any special effort. That growth may not always be easy, but unless it's interrupted in some way, an acorn will become an oak. The same is true of the acorns in each of us. We will grow into the people we are meant to be. The acorn is not something that we need to perform. It is simply who we are and who we each will become. But when our process is interrupted or when we try too hard to reshape ourselves under external pressure, we risk a rupture. We become a psyche divided against itself. By the time Theseus reaches the borders of Attica, he has faced 5 brutal labors. He is strong, yes, but he's also exhausted. And it's in that moment of weariness that the road finally opens up to reveal a house, a warm light in the window, and an invitation to finally stop and rest. Let's step into the story and meet our host, the one the locals call Procrustes, the stretcher. The morning sun hung low over the hills as Theseus set out on the last leg of his journey to Athena. He followed the sacred way, Ira Odos, the road walked by the initiates of Demetra's mysteries at Eleusis. But Theseus was walking his own initiation. He felt the pull of his destiny, like a physical tug in his chest. He was so close now. As he walked, the club of Periphetes strapped across his back glinted in the bright sunlight. Under his cloak, the weight of his father's sword brushed against his thigh, a cold secret that kept him tethered to the path, even as his mind raced ahead towards the marbled heights of Athena. Occasionally, he passed others on the road. A farmer led a donkey pulling a cart laden with grain and vegetables. 2 young boys ran behind the cart laughing and shouting as they whipped at one another with long blades of grass. The man nodded at Theseus as he passed. Theseus nodded back. In their eyes, he was simply a tall, broad-shouldered youth in a dusty cloak. In his own heart, he was a prince bound for his throne. Theseus settled into a steady, rhythmic pace, the gait of a man who knows exactly where his feet are taking him. Perhaps it was youthful impatience, or perhaps Helios was driving the horses of the sun's chariot harder today. But the road that rounded the bay seemed to stretch longer and longer as it approached the mountains growing on the horizon that still hid Athena from his view. Almost before he knew it, the shadows were lying in long cracks across the ground, the fissures of night through which great nicks crept into the world. He had hoped to reach Athena before she once again mounted the heavens, but...
Hello, traveler. Where are you headed this evening?
The voice broke Theseus from his thoughts. The man was sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the path. Despite his greying hair and beard, there was a youthfulness in his eyes that made it impossible to guess his age. As Theseus approached, the man stood and stepped towards him with a wide, easy smile.
I'm on my way to Athena, sir. I was hoping to reach the city gates by nightfall.
The man looked around, finding the sun in the western sky, and then nodded towards the mountains ahead.
It's a long way to go at this hour.
He fell into step beside Theseus, as if they'd been walking together all day.
You know the inn's on the far side. They'll take advantage if you arrive late and tired.
They will? I mean, I didn't know. I was planning to...
Oh,
The man cut Theseus off. He sounded amused.
such a strapping lad. Is this your first time to Athens?
Something in the man's tone made Theseus feel younger than he wanted to. He felt a flush climb into his cheeks.
Yes, sir. I'm going to...
The weight of his father's sword at his side reminded him of his mother's voice.
Tell no one of your purpose, Theseus. Your father's brothers want the throne for themselves. If they discover that a true prince lives, your life will be in terrible danger. Tell no one.
I'm going to look for... work.
He said, as his hand instinctively shifted beneath his cloak to ensure the hilt of the sword was hidden.
Ah, Athena. For work. It's a grand city, lad. But it'll eat you up if you arrive exhausted.
He leaned in slightly, his tone turning conspiratorial.
My home is just there, up against the slope. Do you see? Over there, where the roads meet. My wife has a pot of stew on the hearth, and we have an extra bed. I built it with my own 2 hands.
He extended both his hands proudly, as if for inspection.
Come, stay the night. Have a meal and a bath. Set off fresh in the morning, and you'll step into the city looking like a prince. Tomorrow you'll find your work. But today, rest.
A flicker of the boyish enthusiasm Theseus had tried so hard to mask made its way from his chest to his cheeks. The road had been long.
You're very generous, sir. It has been a long journey from Argolida.
Argolida. Young man, you have walked far, and through such dangerous land. Tell me, you didn't have any trouble, did you?
Well,
Theseus thought quickly.
I hear it's safer these days. I've heard a champion, one that may one day be as great as Heracles himself, has been ridding the isthmus of its dangers. I heard even the dreadful sow of Crommyon is no more.
Amazing what times we are living in. My son is a trapper. He works in the forests near Corinth. He has told me stories of wild beasts and what he hunts out there on the isthmus.
The hairs on the back of Theseus's neck stood on end as he remembered Sinis and the dreadful bent pines. But he couldn't have been this man's son. Could he?
Anyway, now I must insist. Tonight you will be a guest in my house. People around here call me Procrustes.
The... stretcher?
Yes, it is a silly name. My wife and I stretch what little we have to welcome any traveler in need. Come along. It's not far.
And putting a strong arm around Theseus's back, he ushered him up the road towards the little house in the distance. As they walked, the 2 men spoke and laughed together as the blue shadows of evening lengthened. By the time they arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon. The house sat nestled against the slope of a hill overlooking a junction in the road, a humble structure of stone and timber. It seemed to lean into the mountain as if trying to hide itself among the growing shadows. Procrustes pushed the door open, and as they crossed the threshold, the warmth of the hearth carried smells of rosemary, garlic, and stewing beans and meats. Theseus's stomach growled.
Celia, we have a guest.
From the shadows of the kitchen, a woman emerged. She moved with the graceful efficiency of the royal servants Theseus had seen in his grandfather's palace, her footsteps making no sound on the packed earth floor. She was dressed in fine linen that seemed greyed by ash, her hair bound tight, and her face bore the practiced smile of one used to welcoming guests. She seemed completely unsurprised at his presence.
This young man has come all the way from Argolida. He needs the strength of a good meal and a decent bed.
He turned to Theseus, gesturing for him to enter the house and make himself at home.
This is my wife, the daughter of a king, once, though she finds my own craft far more reliable than the whims of a court. Isn't that right, my dear?
Silea didn't answer. She didn't even look up. She simply nodded her head and moved to the fire. From a large pot beside the fireplace, she drew a bowl of warm water.
Have a seat at the table, lad. You must be hungry.
Theseus unslung the bronze club and leaned it beside the door. Then he unfastened his cloak and drew it off. In the same motion, using the cloth as cover, he eased the sword free from its place in his belt and wrapped the blade into the folds. He laid the bundle by the threshold, then lifted the club and settled it across the cloth. He glanced at Procrustes and his wife. If his hosts had noticed anything, neither of them said a word. He made his way over to the round table in front of the fireplace. The warmth of the flames gently kneaded his legs. He hadn't realized how tired he was. He sat. Silea brought the clay bowl of warm water over to him and stood silently, watching the gently sloshing surface of the water.
Wash your hands, lad,
Procrustes said.
Let's eat.
After both he and his host had washed their hands, Silea disappeared around the corner with the bowl of water, and in a moment returned with 2 more bowls. From another pot at the hearth, she ladled stew into them and set them before the men. Never once did she meet his gaze. Even when he thanked her, she smiled and nodded, but kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere near his collarbone. As the 2 men ate, Silea unhooked the pot from its iron arm and carried it away without a word. Theseus watched her vanish around the corner with it. A moment later, she returned with the pot refilled, set it back beside the hearth, and stood waiting, still attentive, until the water warmed again. Then she did it again, without looking at either of the 2 men. The silence of the house began to ring in his ears. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Theseus was vaguely aware that Procrustes was talking something about a small smithy he operated out at the back of the house. Theseus tried to focus on what his host was saying, but his attention was drawn more and more into the strange quiet beyond their small round table in the glowing light of the hearth.
It is solid bronze, isn't it?
Bronze?
Theseus's mind snapped back into the conversation.
I'm sorry. What were you saying? I must be more tired than I realized. My mind wandered.
Of course you are.
Procrustes gave an understanding nod and patted Theseus on the shoulder.
I was just asking if that club you were carrying is solid bronze. It is a remarkable piece of handiwork.
Yes, I believe it is.
Theseus replied.
It was loaned to me by
He searched for a reasonable answer.
a craftsman in Epidaurus. He said I needed a proper weapon for the road.
He would need to be more careful. The food and the warmth were causing him to drop his guard. But this place seemed safe enough, and he was tired.
Well,
Procrustes rose from his seat.
you're tired, lad. And you've got a whole adventure ahead of you. Let's get you bathed and to bed.
As if on cue, Silea appeared. She was carrying a large folded bundle of cloth.
Come, let us show you to your rest.
Silea, the folded bundle under one arm and a small oil lamp in her free hand, led the way down a short corridor that descended 3 stone steps into a guest room. 2 clay lamps hung from delicate chains, pooling warm light over a space that was meticulously swept. Against the far wall stood a single sturdy bed of polished wood. To the right, half hidden behind the open door, was a wide basin that steamed faintly. So this was what Silea had been doing all evening.
And there it is.
He gestured towards the bed.
I'm not much of a carpenter, but I don't think I did too badly. What do you think?
Theseus looked. The bed, though sturdy enough, looked small. A large child might have been comfortable in it, but for him, it would be a compromise. Seleia crossed the room and laid the folded bedding at the foot of the bed. She smoothed it once, and then turned, eyes down, silent as ever, and left.
It looks great! Thank you again for your hospitality, sir.
Think nothing of it, lad. Bathe while the water is still warm.
He indicated towards the basin.
And if you need anything, just let me know.
Procrustes stepped back and let his gaze travel the room as though he were checking for something. Then he turned and closed the door quietly behind him. Theseus heard his footsteps climb the stairs and fade into the house. He washed as best he could, then unfolded the bedding. It smelled of lavender and rosemary. He lay down. His feet hung over the edge. He turned, curled, and tried to fold himself smaller. Nothing worked. The mattress held his shoulders, but not his legs, and the bedding was too thin to soften the cold floor. He remembered his cloak, bundled by the main entrance where he'd left it, and the sword wrapped in its folds beneath the club. If he had it, he could spread it on the floor and sleep there. His generous hosts wouldn't be offended, would they? He wasn't complaining. He was simply making do. At last, he stood up, pulled on his tunic, and quietly opened the door of his room. He climbed the 3 stone steps and made his way down the corridor. He paused before entering the main room, listening. Inside, he could hear the gentle crackle of the fire and the sound of bristles passing over leather. Theseus took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Procrustes was seated by the hearth, drawing a cloth across the teeth of a saw that shone in the flickering light of the fire. Seleia knelt at his feet, her head bowed, scrubbing his heavy boots. Neither of them spoke. The moment Theseus entered the room, the scene changed. Seleia rose in one quick movement and slipped the brush into the folds of her dress. Then she vanished into the kitchen. Procrustes stood, the paternal smile snapping back onto his face like a trap.
Ah, lad, is there something I can help you with? Not comfortable, son? Is the bed not right?
Theseus stole a glance towards the main entrance. His bundled cloak lay there still, unmoved beneath the weight of the bronze club.
It's a fine bed, sir, but I'm too large for it. I was coming out to get my cloak. I might just sleep on the floor. After traveling, I'm used to it, so it's no trouble at all.
He was over-explaining himself. That same feeling of being younger than he was, as if he were still a child, was back. The last thing he wanted to do was break the laws of hospitality by insulting his generous host.
I'm very grateful for...
Nonsense.
Procrustes lifted the saw and tapped the tip of its blade. In the warm light, it flashed blue and cold.
If the traveler does not fit the bed, it is simply a matter of adjustment. I have my tools right here. Come, let's see to it that you fit.
Procrustes stood. He held the saw in one hand, and with the other lifted the small oil lamp from the table where they had eaten. Together, they returned down the corridor, down the 3 stone steps, and into the room. It felt smaller than before. Procrustes closed the door.
Let's see,
He said.
Lie down, lad, exactly as you did before. Let's see what we're dealing with here.
He watched as Theseus lay back.
Get comfortable, son. I'm a master of proportion. It just won't do to have a guest who doesn't fit the furniture.
Theseus felt the cold wood of the frame against his neck. Procrustes stood near the foot of the bed, brow creased in appraisal, like a tailor taking a measurement. He set the lamp on the floor and tapped the teeth of the saw against his palm.
Ah, yes, I see the problem.
He said after a moment.
You're just too big. You can't possibly be comfortable.
Before Theseus could sit up, Procrustes leaned across him, pinning him just above the left knee with his elbow, holding his right leg down in a vice-like grip.
What are you doing? Let me up!
Procrustes took no notice. Theseus thrashed and hammered at the man's back and neck. He may as well have been striking stone. Procrustes bore down with the calm weight of habit. He knew this work. He'd done it before. Many times.
Hush, lad,
He said.
No more struggle. No more fuss. This is where you belong, and you'll fit soon enough.
In his right hand, the fine teeth of the saw flashed in the lamplight. Theseus's breath caught in his neck. Panic rose hot in his throat, and then he cut it off. He went limp.
There you go. It'll all be over soon.
Procrustes shifted his balance, tightening the pin, lining the saw up with the soft flesh just below the kneecap. And that was all Theseus needed. He snapped his upper body forward in a tight crunch, fast, silent, and caught the wrist of the man gripping his leg with both hands. He clamped it to his chest and threw himself back onto the mattress like a falling stone. Strong and practiced though Procrustes was, the elbow pinning the youth could not withstand the weight leaning on it and the wrench of Theseus's pull. The arm twisted. The elbow took the strain. Something popped. Procrustes cried out, sharp, involuntary, as his balance broke and he spun away from the bed. The saw clattered to the ground as the man staggered backwards, struck the wall, and sank to the floor. Theseus was already on his feet on the far side of the bed. Procrustes cursed and hauled himself upright, cradling his ruined arm to his chest. The bed lay between them. Outrage and pain cut hard lines into Procrustes' face as he circled the foot of the bed. Furious, he lunged at Theseus, trying to cut the corner, trying to close the gap between them. And Theseus stepped in and drove his shoulder into Procrustes' chest. The bed frame caught the larger man behind the knees. He tried to step back, and there was nowhere to put his feet. He toppled hard onto the bed, twisting as he fell. His injured arm folded under him, and he made the sound that was neither a word nor a scream. His face blanched, his eyelids fluttered. Then he went slack. Theseus worked fast. Before Procrustes had even begun regaining consciousness, he had torn the bedding into long strips, fed them underneath the bed frame, and hauled them back up over the body of his host, high across his shoulders, then the ribs. Another went under and then over the hips. Theseus fed the ends beneath the frame, hauled them back up, and cinched them until the fabric sang with tension. Then he tied them off on the side rail of the bed. As Theseus finished securing the last knot, Procrustes bucked as he came to. The bed answered, wood groaning, fabric biting. But the knots held. As the room swam back into focus, Procrustes saw Theseus standing over him, the saw in his hand. His eyes widened.
Insolent child, you don't understand.
He rasped.
This is my home.
Theseus's lips tightened. He lifted the saw. In the lamplight, the blade flashed bronze.
Oh,
He said quietly.
I do.
Procrustes thrashed once, testing his bonds. The bed, the thing he'd built with his own hands, creaked beneath his weight. The trap held its maker fast.
You can't.
Theseus lowered the saw.
You wanted your guest to fit?
He said,
Tonight, you fit.
We don't need to follow the blade as it does its grisly work. From the road, the house would still have looked like a refuge, a warm window at a crossroad, a light in the dark. And then a scream, thin at first, then tearing. In the distance, the wolves on Mount Korydallos answered. When quiet returned, it returned all at once. The lamps steadied. The water in the basin behind the door lay perfectly still. Not even a ripple disturbed its surface. Theseus stood for a long moment, listening to his own breath. Then he turned, opened the door, and went back up the corridor.
Silea?
Theseus called into the main room.
Are you here?
There was no answer. The hearth still glowed. The kitchen was empty. The doorway stood open to the night, and cold air moved through the house. Theseus washed the stains of his grisly labor from himself in the pot of water warming by the fire. Then he gathered his cloak from where it lay by the entrance, the sword still wrapped in its folds beneath the club, and carried the bundle to the hearth. He tossed another log onto the coals. He sat with his back to the wall, warmth at his knees, and Theseus slept. In the morning, he would walk on to Athena. Okay, well, that was the story of Theseus' final confrontation on the road to Athena. It's from this story that the image of the Procrustean bed is drawn. A Procrustean bed is an arbitrary standard that we have to meet in order to be accepted in some field or social environment. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but before we get there, I want to revisit a conversation that we had earlier in this series. Since we're going to be exploring what it could mean for Theseus to be laid out on the Procrustean bed and potentially lose his legs as a result, I think we should begin by taking one more look at the archetype of the hero. When we encounter hero stories, our first instinct is often to look for inspiration, to treat the character as a role model, and to compare ourselves to them. But if we look closer at Theseus, especially at what takes place later in his life, we see someone who is just as likely to be rash, arrogant, or blind as he is to be courageous. So for our purposes, I'd like to invite you to look at Theseus not as a figure of moral instruction, but as a function. In the geography of the psyche, the hero is a bridge builder. You can already see that in Theseus' dual parentage. Theseus is born of mortal lineage. This presents the sunlit world of conscious awareness and the ego, the part of us that can witness what's happening, make choices, and take responsibility. When the hero function is active, we become aware of the confrontation it facilitates, because those confrontations are the steps that lead us to growth. On the other hand, Theseus is also the son of Poseidon, the earth shaker, the god of the sea. So he belongs equally to the deep, creative, and sometimes dangerous waters of the unconscious. In the same way, the hero archetype in each of us is born from both consciousness and the unconscious. It belongs to and connects both of these inner realms. Through the heroic acts we've been tracing over the past few episodes, the energy of the wilderness can be brought into the ordered world of consciousness, not as chaos, but as something that can be worked with, refined, and integrated. Although we talk about the hero archetype as a noun, it's often more useful to think of it as a verb, as a function of the psyche, rather than as a limb like an arm or a hand. Its job is to facilitate the integration of unconscious contents with conscious ego in an automatic and natural process that Carl Jung referred to as individuation. Viewed this way, Theseus' long road to Athena becomes an integrative journey, illustrating how the hero archetype brings us into contact with hidden, unacknowledged parts of ourselves that often appear as obstacles on our path. Confronting such obstacles is scary for Theseus as well as for us. But stories like this one remind us that these encounters happen so that these neglected and outcast parts of ourselves can be brought to awareness and turned into useful tools that are subject to our control. Back at the beginning of the story, Theseus uncovers a sword and a pair of sandals that his mortal father, King Aegeus of Athena, left hidden beneath a heavy rock. They are the symbols of his destiny. From almost the moment he was conceived, they were already waiting for the day he would finally be able to claim them. They represent the Acorn, what James Hillman describes as a pre-existent soul image that acts as a template, guiding each of us towards who we are meant to be and what we value. In the myth, Theseus carries these items with him on the road. They're always with him, even though the story doesn't really mention them again until he reaches Athena. That quiet detail is the myth's way of showing us what it looks like to follow the natural path of growing up. It doesn't really require special enlightenment or discipline, only that we move through our lives following the needles of our inner compass as they swing between our desires and values. The hero archetype is most visible in initiatory or liminal spaces, the passage between one stage in life, however great or small, and the next. This process unfolds in what we can broadly think of as two arcs. First, there's the descent arc, an inward exploratory movement and confrontation with what's been hidden, actively avoided, or unacknowledged. Recovery spaces have a saying: you can't change what you don't acknowledge, and it maps cleanly onto this part of the road. Before anything can be integrated, it has to be seen. It has to be faced. It has to be brought into the light of consciousness, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it complicates the story that we've been telling ourselves about who we are or what is true. But recognition doesn't end the work. It's the beginning of a different phase. In heroic stories, the descent only becomes meaningful when the hero returns. The hero goes out into the wilderness, into the dragon's territory, not simply to prove their courage, but to recover something necessary for life, a resource, a truth, an energy that the community needs and that the hero also needs in order to become whole. After that, the hero must return to civilization. This return with the prize is the ascent arc of the journey. It's the movement through which insight becomes embodied, where whatever shifted inside has to take form in our choices, speech, boundaries, or relationships, and the way that we show up in the world. It's where growth stops being a private realization and becomes a lived pattern. The ascent arc is where our communities get involved, because whether we like it or not, personal change becomes a public affair once we begin to act on it. So, the bandits that appear on the descent arc can be read as inward-facing encounters, conflicts, shadows, distortions inside the psyche, while the figures we meet on the ascent part of the journey are different. They still have a psychological dimension, of course, but they are manifest in our relationship to the social world around us. This process is, in a deep sense, automatic. It is as natural as an acorn growing into an oak tree. An acorn doesn't need a special class or a motivational speech to realize its potential as an oak. It just grows towards what it is. But with that type of acorn, as with the metaphorical acorn we each carry, that growth can be influenced. For the physical acorn, the most reliable way to deform its growth is to keep it confined, keep it in a small pot, keep pruning its roots and branches, keep rewarding the parts that look acceptable, and keep cutting back the parts that don't. This is the art of bonsai. The tree is still alive. It grows, but it's denied its natural stature, shaped instead by shears and wire. But one day, if that little tree is planted in deep and hospitable earth, it will reach again for its true stature. And as we'll see, the same is true for us. As we're working with myth and archetypal imagery, it's worth remembering. Archetypal images, like the hero, don't appear first in stories and then get installed in us through our understanding. These images appear in our stories because they reflect something that has always been there in the psyche doing its work. So by noticing the hero pattern, we're not trying to gain some new power or ability. The aim is to become more aware of what's already happening, and in doing so, bring more clarity to the process. That clarity can steady us, sometimes even help move us along. At the very least, it gives us language to understand and narrate what we experience as we grow. And when we're in the middle of a life transition, when we're moving between careers, questioning a faith tradition, or navigating the end of a relationship, the hero function is hard at work within us. Energy doesn't appear from nowhere, and it is a finite resource. Progress along an initiatory road can feel like a relentless, featureless expanse. It can be tiring. And in those moments, we may, like Theseus in today's story, find the promise of rest at another archetypal image, an inn. The image of the inn. In stories, an inn or tavern holds two intertwined functions: shelter and social connection. Inns appear, as Martha Grimes beautifully puts it, at a confluence of roads. That's true both physically and symbolically. They're where paths meet, but also where lives overlap, where travelers on different journeys come together and find an environment that echoes the comfort of home without returning them there. In our lives, inns show up as social spaces, friendships, workplaces, spiritual communities, any place that offers the feeling, even briefly, that we don't have to translate or edit ourselves in order to be welcomed. They're places where the existence of our acorns, the sword and sandals that we each carry, is acknowledged without us having to keep them on display, and where it's taken as a given that everyone is headed somewhere. The inn itself is not the destination. When the road gets long and when the world starts to feel darker, and you see the lights of such an inn up ahead, the promise of that welcome can be almost irresistible. The image of the innkeeper. Every inn needs an innkeeper. They are the steward of the refuge, the one who embodies hospitality, who tends the fire, and who recognizes what it costs the traveler to be on the road. In a healthy inn, the innkeeper's role is not only to facilitate rest, but to grant a kind of permission for the traveler to be unfinished, to recover, and to belong for a night without surrendering their journey. The innkeeper, like the hero, is a kind of bridge builder too. They serve as the intermediary between the traveler and the resources available in the social space of the inn itself. They facilitate the arrival, the restoration, and finally the return of the traveler to their path when they leave again. The inn in our story appears on the ascent arc of Theseus' journey. It's the part that illustrates how our inner work begins to show up in public. As we change, we naturally start searching for inn-like spaces where what's emerging inside of us can be met, mirrored, and strengthened by a community. The inn itself is just a building. It's the presence and attitude of the innkeeper, the host, that determines what kind of space it ultimately is. Now, Procrustes isn't called an innkeeper by any of the sources, but he presents himself as one. He invites travelers in, he offers rest, and once they accept the bed, he extracts a brutal price. So, before we embark on an exploration of what the shadow images of the inn and innkeeper might be, I want to name the danger of these types of spaces plainly: coercive belonging. Coercive belonging rarely announces itself up front. It borrows the language of care, and it arrives looking like a refuge. It's only later, when you look back and realize that the welcome has cost you parts of yourself, that you can recognize the coercive nature of the inn you entered. The internet has put 1,000 doors to 1,000 inns in our pockets. And in our increasingly polarized world, where many of us feel stretched thin and constantly on trial, a warm welcome can feel like a rescue. And that's exactly where shadow inns thrive. So please be aware, the next section addresses coercive belonging and high control dynamics. If this hits a little close to home for you, please take your time, or if you're not ready to revisit it just yet, skip ahead to the Procrustes and Sinis segment. The shadow inn and shadow innkeeper. If the shadows of the inn or the innkeeper were a simple inversion of the healthy image's qualities, we'd have no difficulty distinguishing them. Nobody goes looking for sanctuary in a place that advertises its intention to detain or stunt the growth of any who cross its threshold. The problem for Theseus, as for each of us, is that the shadow inn presents itself as a shelter. In the evening twilight, the light in the windows burns as brightly, the doorway beckons as reassuringly, and the room and board on offer still feel just as safe at first. You're received, you're fed, there's companionship, a sense of camaraderie, the kind of relief you may have been waiting a lifetime to experience. It's only once you've really settled in that it begins to shed its disguise. This doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in 100 small, seductive shifts. At first, the inn offers you relief and welcome, but then it begins teaching you to fear what lies beyond its windows. What isn't lit by its hearth gets spoken of as darkness, and the road outside, the same road that delivered you to its door, gets recast as dangerous and confusing, a lesser path. Eventually, when the thought of stepping back onto the road returns, leaving is framed as betrayal. Inns like these are places where your physical presence is welcome, but your acorn is not. The message they inculcate over time is subtle but consistent. You've arrived. Stop searching now. Stop wondering now. Sit. Stay. Shadow inns can appear in many different forms. They can show up as social groups, spiritual or self-help communities, even work environments. But they are, all of them, psychic parasites, and it's your soul that plays host to them, keeping them warm as they feed on your life's energy. In a shadow inn, restoration becomes restriction, and comfort becomes capture. Sadly, this is also true about many of the communities we seek when we're most in need of reassurance and a sense of belonging. In the myth, Procrustes has one goal: to lure travelers to his house so that he can measure them against a bed that is designed not to fit them. If they're too short, he stretches them, dislocating their joints and rendering them unable to continue their journeys. If they're too tall, like Theseus was, he cuts off their legs, again, bringing their journeys and lives to a premature end. His goal is to lure them into a place where they believe they'll be able to find rest, only to reshape them according to his own measure. This is the Procrustean pattern, his modus operandi. The Procrustean pattern doesn't only appear in overtly organized groups, it also shows up in other ways in which we interact with the world. Things that don't look like communities at all, but that answer similar needs. We encounter it in digital platforms engineered to keep you scrolling, games designed around compulsive reward cycles, and the algorithmic responses to our likes and searches that slowly tighten social media feeds into ideological echo chambers. It even appears in certain forms of human-AI entanglement, as suggested by emerging case literature on what is being called AI-associated psychosis. Each of these contexts offers a refuge of a kind: relief, distraction, a feeling of accomplishment, even belonging. But these comforts are often manufactured to promote and prolong engagement, more often than not at the cost of your attention, your emotional autonomy, and, in severe cases, your ability to keep walking your road on your own. None of these tools are inherently Procrustean. The shadow inn pattern emerges when the refuge they offer gives rise to dependency, and dependency then reshapes the traveler. Now, places like this always have their own facilitators, a shadow innkeeper for the shadow inn. The shadow version of the innkeeper still speaks the language of care. They may even feel sincere. They offer exactly what a weary nervous system wants most: safety, certainty, a sense of belonging, an end, even temporarily, to the tiring work of the road. If the healthy version of the innkeeper's job is to facilitate rest and restoration, the shadow innkeeper facilitates extraction. Before the weary traveler even realizes there's a price to be paid, they begin taking payment in the form of compliance. In the healthy image, the innkeeper serves the traveler. In the shadow image, the traveler serves the inn. Procrustes is the incarnation of this inversion, and the myth gives us a brutally clear image of the cost he extracts. As Theseus discovered, admission to the Procrustean inn is free, but accepting the offer of a bed will cost you your ability to continue on your journey. The architecture of the trap. I want to step away from the myth for a moment and look at this all through a slightly more academic lens. Robert Jay Lifton, a psychiatrist who studied high-control environments, systems that demand total loyalty and punish deviation, describes how places like this work. They don't rely on force alone. They run a far more sophisticated operation. In a long-term study of political prisoners who were, at least for a while, converted to a cause diametrically opposed to their worldview, Lifton observed that the conversion was driven by a scripted drama of death and rebirth, manufactured, rehearsed, and imposed from outside. The process he documents is an engineered path of growth that closely resembles the hero's journey we've been tracing with Theseus, but with one lethal difference. The obstacles the travelers encounter on this route don't arise from within their own soul. They are imposed by the innkeeper. What follows is a practical summary of the process described by Robert Jay Lifton, the way the trap gets built piece by piece until it starts to feel like the only reality in town. To make it easier to recognize in groups, institutions, relationships, or even in your own inner life, I'm going to map it the same way we've been walking Theseus's road, in 2 arcs, a descent arc, a turning point, and then an ascent. The descent arc, confronting a manufactured shadow. According to Lifton, the first target in coercive environments is your sense of self, the sense of being enough. You're ushered gently but relentlessly into a conviction that your acorn, the core of what makes you you, is fundamentally flawed somehow. Whether it's your performance, your spiritual standing, or your values, you're gradually trained into a posture of existential guilt. The shadow innkeeper makes this look like care and concern, insisting that you're only being helped, that this is all for your own good. It can be difficult to spot this process, especially if we trust the authority of that place. Having been on our own journeys for so long, we're used to seeing shadows rather than light within ourselves. Remember Periphetes, remember Sinis, remember that ravenous wild Crommyonian sow. If we've already met monsters on the inward road, we can hardly be surprised to be told there are more, ones we missed, until here they can be seen at last, illuminated and laid bare in the lamplit lodgings of the inn. In coercive environments, we're led to confront what the innkeeper, the trusted authority of that inn, identifies as our shadows. We're encouraged to denounce the self we arrived with, to cut away the sword and the sandals we came carrying, and if we trust that the voice, or voices, guiding this process are speaking from a morally, intellectually, or spiritually superior position, this self-betrayal starts to feel like moral progress. If the encounter with the Crommyonian sow, the devouring mother archetype, marked the turning point on Theseus's path, after which the road began to rise, then manufactured shame and guilt function as its psychological counterpart in coercive environments. Here, these are the devouring forces that eat away at the traveler's sense of self-worth until it begins to feel as though survival or salvation depends on being liberated from them. The turning point. Now, shame and guilt are not the same thing, Although they both arise from a perceived personal deficiency, shame causes us to isolate ourselves, while guilt carries with it a feeling of responsibility. When harnessed, guilt can serve as a motivation for change. Coercive environments use both as tools to accomplish their goals. Saturated in shame, we're ready to cling to any offer of belonging that comes our way. And that's when the carefully installed sense of guilt is transmuted into motivation. This happens when we're offered grace, a bridge back to belonging, provided we take the shape prepared for us. As Lifton puts it, since ideological totalists become the ultimate judges of good and evil within their world, they are able to use these universal tendencies toward guilt and shame as emotional levers for their controlling and manipulative influences. They become the arbiters of existential guilt, authorities without limit in dealing with others' limitations. And their power is nowhere more evident than in their capacity to forgive. When the prospect of forgiveness, the redemption of the monsters we've been shown within ourselves, is presented by a trusted authority, it feels like encouragement. Finally, somebody believes in us and our ability to do and be better. We begin to want to become exactly who they want us to be, because the alternative, rejection, starts to feel like a kind of death. Their ideology begins to masquerade as the voice of our own inner guide. The demon of the inn drowns out the daimon within. The ascent, the rebirth of the measured self. Lifton calls the last stage of this process the rebirth, but it's not a resurrection of the true self or of the self you're actually meant to be. It's a rebirth in the image of the inn, and it marks the point at which we conform to the shape prescribed by the inn. You emerge as a new person who fits the bed, measured, adjusted, and made suitable. This is the bonsai logic again. The shadow inn does to our acorns what a bonsai master does to an oak sapling. The roots trimmed back, the branches shaped into an approved silhouette, the whole thing kept small enough to be managed in a shallow pot. It still grows, of course it does, but only in ways that can be shaped and managed. That's the tragedy of the shadow inn. It offers a simulation of growth. It builds bridges not into your own depths, but from an external dogma directly into your heart. And there can be real relief in finally fitting in there, but it comes at a cost. You trade the connection to your authentic center, to your acorn, for a comfort that was never meant to help you continue your journey. Procrustes' method is the myth's brutal shorthand for this same kind of rebirth. He offers the traveler a bed that is designed in such a way that they will not fit. If the traveler is too short, he stretches them. This stretching happens in our own lives when we're stretched or pulled into behaviors and beliefs that aren't congruent with the shape of the self. It's almost like a kind of high-stakes peer pressure. And if they're too tall, he amputates what extends beyond the approved silhouette, cutting away what won't fit. Notice what gets targeted. I'm 6'5". That's about 195 centimeters tall. I know what hangs off the end of a bed first. Your feet. The very things you need to keep traveling. That's the point. Coercive environments like the shadow inn don't only harm you, they make you unable to walk the road you were on. Hospitality turns into incarceration, not by chains, but by reshaping you until leaving is no longer possible, or at least incredibly difficult. And this pattern of coercion isn't limited to the obvious context of so-called high control groups. Wherever an in-group, out-group dynamic emerges, in any community in which an us versus them narrative is dominant, or where positive moral value is ascribed to membership of a specific group, the same logic appears. The trouble is, as we've mentioned before, it can be very difficult to identify especially if that narrative, the voice of the shadow innkeeper themselves, has begun speaking from inside your own head. When that happens, you begin trimming yourself without anyone else even being given a chance. How to spot a shadow in. Most people don't think about coercion. We don't sit around building theories about control systems, but we do think about belonging. We think about meaning. We think about finding a place where we can be ourselves, be met, and grow. It's usually only after something begins to feel off, after what we thought was a welcome starts tightening around us, that we go looking for the language to describe what's happening to us. Before we move on, I want to be clear. Not every corrective environment is coercive. Not every teacher is an innkeeper with a measuring tape behind their back. In a healthy setting, there is what Lifton describes as a three-way tension between the student, the teacher, and the ideas. The ideas have weight of their own. They can challenge both student and teacher. A healthy mentor doesn't demand omnipotence and doesn't require you to demolish your old identity in order to be allowed to learn. The goal is realization, helping you express what is already trying to grow in you, rather than molding you into a rigid, prefabricated shape. So while not every corrective environment is coercive, not every environment that has used or uses coercive methods is trying to hurt people. Even the most well-intentioned social spaces or relationships may at times use coercive means to achieve its goals. This does not negate or destroy whatever truth there may be communicated in those contexts, and this is what makes a shadow-in so difficult to recognize. We all need to learn more about how to respect the incredible diversity of human experience and expression without feeling the need to trim it to fit our own expectations, while at the same time educating ourselves and others about the horrific psychological and emotional violence that can be done, all too often in the name of the best and highest ideals, through the application of these Procrustean methods. So, how can you spot a shadow-in or Procrustean pattern? Well, one simple question is this. In any social context, your work, your family, or your spiritual group, do you feel safer being approved of than being known? In a shadow-in, belonging often comes with conditions that are hard to identify at first. You begin to sense that there's a narrow emotional range you're allowed to inhabit. You learn, without anyone even having to name them, which feelings make the room go cold and which questions make the lamps flicker. You start editing yourself, not because you're learning discernment, but because you're just trying to stay inside that circle of warmth. Sometimes it even gets dressed up as growth. People praise your progress, but the progress always seems to make you easier to manage. You find yourself rehearsing your thoughts before you're even sure what you think, scanning your own mind for the version of yourself that will be easiest to receive by the people in the group. And leaving, when you finally imagine it, feels strangely expensive, not only socially, but existentially, as if the road outside has been made unreal or unsafe or morally deplorable. And perhaps the clearest sign is this. When you look closely, you'll notice that the innkeeper does not fit the same bed they expect you to lie in. If any of that hits a nerve, go gently with yourself. These patterns are powerful partly because they arrive wearing warmth, and because the needs they answer, connection, meaning, and that sense of certainty and belonging, are not weaknesses. They're just human, and they're common to all of us. Procrustes and Sinis. It's tempting to think of Procrustes only as an oppressive force out there in the world, someone or something we encounter when we accept the wrong invitation, get misled, and pay for it. And yes, predatory, coercive environments do exist, and we'd be wise to learn how they work. But to treat Procrustes as only external is to miss the more intimate danger, the way the measuring bed gets installed within each of us. This too is a kind of shadow-in, and as uncomfortable as it is to admit, the belief that we are only ever forced into unnatural shapes by other people is a strangely comforting denial, because it spares us from noticing how often we participate in our own constriction. So before we take a look at another story, one that offers a bit of hope for those of us, perhaps that's most of us, who have found themselves on the receiving end of the shadow-in's hospitality, I want to turn back for a moment to the outlaw we met earlier on this road, Sinis, the pine-bender. In episode 5, we found him in a forest near Corinth. He takes unwary travelers, binds them to 2 bent pines, and releases the tension, tearing his victims in half. It's a brutal image, but it's also a psychologically accurate one. Theseus met Sinis on the descent arc of his journey, the inward road, where the conflicts are not yet public-facing, not yet social in the obvious way. They're private, they're internal. They're the kind of forces that pull a person apart from the inside. Sinis is what it feels like when the ego gets caught in a tension between 2 pressures that can't easily be reconciled. What you are and what you think you must be in order to be acceptable, for example. Lifton names this with clinical clarity as the contrast between what one is and what one would be. And that contrast becomes a kind of inner machinery. The need to belong meets the standards of belonging, and out of that collision, a voice is born, a measuring voice, that can rule us with far less resistance than any external authority ever could, because it speaks from inside our own skull. What does it mean to psychologically defeat Sinis, then? Well, overcoming Sinis is not to destroy the tension, because tension is part of growth. The task is to stop being torn apart by it, to hold the opposites in awareness without rushing to resolve them through self-betrayal, to learn slowly to walk the grey road. And that's why Sinis appears before Procrustes. When we lose sight of the bent pines, when we forget we're in a tension that needs to be held, we start craving relief. We start looking for a way to discharge the strain. That is when Procrustes' offer becomes dangerous, the promise of rest and the promise of certainty that will end the pulling. In other words, if you haven't dealt with Sinis within, Procrustes outside will feel more like rescue. Now here's where the myth does something I love. It doesn't only give us a psychological sequence, it gives us a genealogical hint. The sources don't always agree on names. Plutarch calls the innkeeper Damastis and notes that he is surnamed Procrustes. Apollodorus uses Damastis as well and adds that some call him Polypemon. Pausanias gives Polypemon and, like Plutarch, notes the surname Procrustes. Greek myth is a tangle of overlapping traditions, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds trying to sort out who is related to whom and how. Where it gets interesting is when we turn back to the story of Sinis. When Apollodorus tells the story of Sinis, he drops an interesting detail. He identifies Sinis as the son of Polypemon by Silea, daughter of Corinthus. Suddenly the myth offers a chilling picture of how some of those Sinis-like impulses get into our own hearts. The bed begets the bender. Procrustes, or Polypemon as some know him, doesn't only live out there as a mechanism of social control. Over time, the systemic Procrustean standards and expectations that exist in our communities, even if they are never stated explicitly or taught as a principle, father Sinis-like voices within us. A measuring culture produces a measuring conscience. A society that sorts people into acceptable and unacceptable shapes eventually installs a sorter inside its members. And this is where we have to be honest. Nobody wants to admit that they carry an inner Procrustean template, a private standard that dictates the acceptable form other people should take. Nobody wants to admit that they've absorbed prejudicial notions about sex, gender, ethnicity, or culture against which they measure the world around them. But to some degree, most of us have. None of us decide to adopt prejudicial beliefs. We inherit them without even noticing it. They arrive through 1,000 unspoken lessons: what gets rewarded, what gets mocked, what gets coded as normal, and what gets treated as a problem. As we grow up, we absorb them as part of the unspoken lessons we learn about belonging and our place in the pecking order of society. They are sown in our hearts, not by a single malevolent hand, but rather by the collective. And when they finally bear fruit, other people usually notice them before we do. While we might not be able to control or choose what we believe, what we can do is question our beliefs. When we become aware of them, which usually happens when we notice that other people don't believe the same things that we do, instead of passing moral judgments, we can hold our own beliefs up for scrutiny and interrogate them. How certain are we that they are true? How did we decide that they were true? What could make us change our minds about them? This line of self-interrogation is uncomfortable, and if it sounds familiar, it's because this is similar to the process we spoke about back in episode 4, when Theseus encountered Periphetes and claimed the bronze club. Prejudice is another cyclopean bandit with a bronze club blocking the road leading to our full potential. It doesn't only harm its external targets, it also damages the one who carries it. The inner template, the Procrustean bed within, isn't only used to judge and reshape the people around you. It turns back on the one using it as a standard. It begins measuring you too, your body, your desires, your emotions, your place in the hierarchy, your worthiness to belong. It narrows your world, and anything that doesn't fit gets treated as a threat, an embarrassment, or as a defect that must be corrected. The same mechanism that trims other people down to size cuts at your own soul too. So when we spoke about confronting sinis, those snap judgments and inherited reflexes, we were really talking about becoming freer. Freer to hold complexity without panic, freer to stay in relationship without reducing ourselves or others to a label, and freer to keep faith with the shape your acorn is trying to grow into. If we want to be able to face Procrustes in the outward-facing aspects of our lives, we have to be able to recognize sinis on the inner one. First, we must be able to acknowledge and be willing to carry the tension that comes with being human, the tension of being neither purely angelic nor purely animalistic. We have to confront our internalized prejudices, not only because, whether conscious or unconscious, they are morally abhorrent, but because ultimately they turn inward and stunt our own growth. They are the way in which we act like Procrustes, by measuring and mutilating others on the beds built by our own beliefs. They cut us off from experiencing a sense of common humanity and sever the connection between our desires and deeper values, calling the resulting lack of compassion maturity. They drown out the quiet voice of your daimon and call it common sense. A contrasting image. The weight of the acorn. For a moment, stop what you're doing and have a look at yourself. You don't need a mirror for this. I'm asking you to look at yourself honestly, at the shape of your soul. If we look at our lives and see the approved silhouette of a bonsai, the parts of ourselves that have been cut back or that we have trimmed, the parts that have been wired into a specific shape, to fit the small, shallow pots of the shadow inns we've lodged at, it's easy to believe that the acorn has been lost. When we recognize the losses we've suffered, it's also easy to assume that this self-betrayal is permanent. But the biology of the soul is far more stubborn than the lifeless carpentry of the bed. The bed is fixed. The acorn is tenacious. Your acorn is tenacious. The pattern we carry isn't a physical thing that can be measured with wood and rope. It's a gravitational pull, a living force that keeps insisting on its own shape even when it's been constrained for years. And this is where I want to return to the image of the bonsai. That small tree kept in a pot can survive a long time without ever reaching its true stature. But one day, if it's planted in deep, hospitable earth, it reaches again for its full height. And I want you to know, the same is true for us. The hope we find in the next story I want to share with you isn't presented in the image of a hero who fights his way out of one such shadow inn. It's in a man who tries to earn belonging in the service of power, trimming and wiring himself to fit prescribed roles, trying to be useful, acceptable, and chosen. Until, that is, he meets someone who gives him deep earth, someone who holds space for him to offer his service in a way that is congruent with his natural shape. It's the story of a man who discovers that the burden he shoulders is not proof of his unworthiness, but the king he has been seeking all along. Once upon a time, long ago, on a page in history where the wet ink of a new religion was still drying over the names of older gods and monsters, there lived a man named Offerus, a giant of Canaanite lineage, a man whose head brushed the low-hanging branches of the forest and whose shadow stretched across an entire village like an early dusk. For all his size and strength, Offerus's heart was set on one thing. He wanted to find a master whose power would overshadow his strength. After wandering for many days, he came to the court of a mighty king, a man draped in purple and seated upon a grand throne, whose name made the whole world tremble. And for a time, Offerus was content to serve him. One afternoon, a minstrel arrived at the court and was brought into the great hall to sing before the king. As he sang, everyone in the room listened, spellbound by the dark and winding melody. But the spell was broken when Offerus saw the king turn pale. He watched as the great man raised a trembling hand and hastily traced a complicated pattern across his chest. Disturbed, Offerus leaned towards him, his voice vibrating like distant thunder.
My king, what troubles you? What is that sign you made?
The king looked up, his eyes still wide, his regal bearing brittle and small in the big room.
This man sings of the devil. 'Tis a fearful name, that. When I hear it, I make this sign so that he shall have no power over me. This is our only safeguard against one such as he.
The devil? Offerus had never heard of him before. But if he was able to inspire such fear in his own king, he must be powerful indeed. Offerus didn't hesitate. He rose, standing to his full height.
Mighty king, if you are afraid of the devil, then the devil must be stronger than you. I commend you to God, good king, for now I must go find this devil. Perhaps he is the master I am destined to serve.
And with that, he turned his back on the court and walked out onto the open road. He walked eastward, past villages, through valleys, and over mountains, until he came to a great desert. There, in the shimmering heat haze, he came upon a company of knights riding horses that seemed to breathe fire. At their head rode a figure so cold and imposing that the sun itself seemed to dim in his presence. The figure pulled his reins and looked up at the giant.
Ho, stranger! Where are you bound?
Offerus, unafraid of the man, for his heart was set only on finding the lord he sought, replied,
Sir Knight, I have walked far from my home. I am searching for the devil. I have heard he is the strongest king, and I want to serve him.
The knight smiled, a cold, sharp expression that opened like a crack in the dry ground.
I am he.
And so, Offerus entered into the service of the Prince of Darkness. He followed him across the wastes until they came upon a highway. After they had gone a long while on the road, they came upon a strange sight. There, simple and stark against the sky, stood a cross. The devil, the master of all terrors, jerked his horse's reins so hard that the animal screamed. Before Offerus could even ask what was wrong, he fled off the road through thorny thickets and briar patches, circling far out of the way, merely to avoid that piece of wood. When at last Offerus caught up with his master, he asked in confusion,
My lord, why do you flee from that timbered sign?
The devil, with pride still in his voice, could not meet his gaze.
There was a man named Christ who once hung upon a cross like that one. 'Tis a fearful sign, that. When I see it, I must go by another way, for he has power over me. There is no safeguard against one such as he.
Offerus shook his head.
Then I see that I have wasted my time here. You are weaker than he is. Now I must leave you. I am going to find this Christ.
And without saying anything more, he left him and went on alone. He walked and walked. Each time he found a castle, he would go in and inquire whether this was the castle of the king called Christ. And each time he would be told no. He walked and walked, and at last he came into a wilderness so deep that even the birds seemed to have forgotten the way out. He walked and walked, and for 2 days and nights he saw no smoke, no track, no sign of man. But then, on the 3rd day, in the golden light of the late afternoon, he came upon a river, wide as a field, slow at the edges and swift in the middle, the color of old iron. A short distance upstream upon its bank stood a little hut, low-roofed and weather-worn. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney and was lost at once among the branches of the trees that gathered around it, as though trying to shield it out of pity. Offerus looked upon it and thought, not here. No king dwells in such a place. Yet it was the first token of human life he'd seen in many days, and his heart was hungry for a human voice. As he stood there, the undergrowth stirred, and from among the trees emerged an old man. He was small, as bent and as knotted as the roots of the forest, and wrapped in a rough cloak the color of bark. Offerus stepped forward.
Old man, I'm looking for the greatest king. I have traveled far so that I may serve him. Tell me, if you know, where might I find his castle?
The hermit, for that is what the old man was, studied the giant for a long moment.
Stranger, I know this king whom you seek, but you will not find him in any castle.
The old man's gaze remained fixed on Offerus, passing through the breadth of his shoulders, through the great frame the world had always seen first, and resting upon the weariness beneath it.
Then what am I to do? Where am I to go? I have borne myself thus far to offer myself into his service, but if he is nowhere to be found, where should I find my own purpose?
The old man blinked once and turned towards the door of his hut.
Fast. Pray.
He said as he reached for the handle. Offerus's shoulders sank. The power that had held him upright through all the courts and kings, through the desert and before the devil, was gone.
But I can't fast,
he said softly.
My body is too big for it. And I don't know how to pray. I don't have the right words.
The hermit's hand remained on the latch. He didn't move. Then the old man turned to look at Offerus again. For the first time in all his wanderings, Offerus felt that it was not his size that was being seen. but his soul. The hermit's gaze dropped to the giant's hands, huge, calloused, built for labor, not liturgy. And for the briefest moment, Offerus felt ashamed.
What is your name, stranger?
There was no judgment in his voice.
Offerus, sir.
That is a good name.
He said thoughtfully.
Then, Offerus, bring what you do have. Serve in a way you can.
He raised his arm and pointed towards the river.
The waters of that river flow fast and cold. Many drown trying to cross. Go there. Take a staff and make your strength a shelter for those who must pass over. In serving the weak and the weary, you will be serving the greatest king of all. Do this, and he will know you.
Offerus turned and looked at the water. It moved without pity. It moved without pause. He looked at his hands again. For a moment he thought of thrones and banners and mighty service in great halls. But if there was no castle to find, then perhaps there was only this, the crossing and work and the long patience of it all.
That I understand.
And so, Offerus went down to the bank. He built a cabin of wood and set wide, smooth river stones for a hearth. He took a long tree trunk for a staff and learned the river's moods, where it lied, where it lunged, and where it pulled travellers under as if it wanted to keep them. From that time, Offerus became the bridge. Day and night he carried the weak and the weary, his feet finding stones in the dark water while the current clawed at his legs. Then came a night of storm. The sky was bruised purple, and the river ran higher than he had ever seen it. The trees groaned and bowed as the wind drove rain in sheets across the water. None would seek to cross the river this night, so Offerus settled into his hut and listened to the crackle of his fire and the wailing of the storm beyond its walls. Soon he drifted off into a deep sleep. Through the roar of the flood, a voice so small it seemed it ought to have been swallowed at once called out.
Offerus, carry me across.
At the sound of his own name, Offerus started awake. Who would be outside on a night like this? And who had said his name? No traveller had ever spoken it at the river, yet the voice had said it as though it had known him his whole life. Grabbing his staff, he went out into the rain. Lightning tore the sky, and for an instant the bank showed itself. Black trees, white water, but nothing more. Offerus lifted his voice like a lantern in the dark.
Who calls?
But nobody was there, only the flood, worrying at the roots of the trees. Wet and wandering, he returned to his hut. Perhaps it had been a dream. He put a log on the fire and huddled close to its warmth. Outside, the storm didn't lessen. The river roared as though it meant to carry his whole world away with it. And soon he began to feel the drowsy warmth of the fireplace replacing the wetness of the wind and rain. And then, there it was again, closer this time.
Offerus, carry me across.
For a second time, he stepped out into the shrieking maelstrom. He searched the bank, one way and the other, calling into the rain. But there was still no one there, only the water and the branches lashing at the wind. He returned again, troubled. For though he had served many travelers, he had never been called like this, by a voice that used his name, yet had no face. And then it came a third time, very close now, right outside his door.
Offerus, come, carry me across.
Offerus seized his staff and went out, and this time he didn't have to search. There, near the raging edge of the angry river, where the reeds were bowing in obedience to the wind, stood a little child. He was small, no taller than Offerus's knees, soaked through, trembling, and clinging with both hands to the root of a massive tree, as though the river were trying to draw him away. His face was pale in the lightning, his hair plastered to his brow. He didn't cry out again. He only looked up at the giant and held out one small hand.
Offerus, carry me across the river.
Offerus grasped the child's hand firmly and swung him up onto his shoulders. He had carried grown men in armor across this river. The waters that would normally have risen to the height of a tall man's shoulders were only at his waist. This storm would be an inconvenience, but it didn't pose any serious danger to him. Besides, for the giant, the child was as light as a feather. There was more chance of his tiny passenger blowing away in the wind than of being too much of a burden. Offerus stepped into the tempest. The water was moving quickly, tugging at his legs with surprising strength. He angled himself in the current so the water flowed past him. He shortened his stride and slowed his pace. Step by slow, shuffling step, the giant carried his small passenger across the raging torrent. But when he was halfway across the river, something changed. The water didn't only rise, it seemed to thicken around his legs. And the child, that little child who had seemed as light as a feather, was suddenly a weight that no man could bear. Offerus's knees that had never buckled before king or devil, began to feel as though they would give way.
Child, what is this? How have you, who are so small, grown as heavy as the whole world?
Offerus gasped, spitting water from his mouth. Hearing no answer, he drove his staff down into the mud, leaned forward, pulling himself as much as walking across the riverbed. And step by step, teeth clenched and puffing between tight lips, he forced the crossing. At last, his feet found the bank. Panting, Offerus let his staff fall from his hand. He set the child down on the black, wet earth and sank to his knees. Water streamed down from him in sheets, like falls pouring off the side of a mountain.
Who are you, child? What are you?
The child looked up at him from beneath wet locks plastered to his brow, small and yet somehow older than the river.
Offerus, you have lived your whole life looking for a place to belong in the service of the greatest king.
Offerus went still. No man had spoken to him like that. No man had spoken into him like that.
You sought him in courts and deserts and on the high roads. You sought him in the wilderness when all other doors had closed.
The child's gaze didn't flinch.
And now you have carried him.
Offerus's throat tightened.
Who are you?
The child's voice was quiet, certain.
I am he. And if I weighed the same as your whole world, it is because that is what I am.
For a moment, there was only the storm and the rush of blood in the giant's ears. Then the child spoke again.
And you shall be Offerus no longer.
The river roared behind them, but the child's words ran deeper than its powerful current.
The kings of the earth have told you to become smaller, to shrink the purpose in your heart to fit their service, to whittle yourself down into something safe, useful, acceptable. They gave you rooms where you could stay, so long as you did not take up too much space. But you have carried that which is without measure. You crossed without sinking beneath its weight, and when the burden grew unbearable, you did not throw it off.
Offerus bowed forward, palms in the mud, trembling, not so much from the cold as from the deep, merciful shock of being seen.
From this day, your name will be Christopher, the carrier of the Christ child.
Offerus, no, Christopher, looked up, throat tight and eyes stinging.
And for a sign, plant your staff in the earth.
The child's voice seemed further away, and somehow closer to his ear. As Offerus blinked the water from his eyes and looked around, the child was gone. So was the storm. Around him, the world had fallen into a silence so complete that, were it not for the wetness of the earth, he would never have believed there had ever been a storm. From a snarl of reeds at the river's edge, a chorus of frogs began to sing into the first pale light of dawn breaking through the dissolving clouds. Christopher's hand found his staff, and, as he pulled himself to his full height, he pressed it deep into the earth and left it there, standing as a witness. Then he turned and made his way home. The river was still fast, still cold, but a weight had lifted. Not the weight of the child he had carried, a deeper weight, one he had carried unrecognized through all his years. And as the light grew, and as the world began to wake, the staff took root. Green split the bark, leaves unfurled, and by the time the sun cleared the trees, the staff he had planted on the opposite bank of the river stood alive, no longer a dead pole cut to purpose, but a thing restored to its true nature, rising past the measure that had been set for it, reaching again for its true stature. Some people say that if you find that river, you can still see it there to this day. The legend, the bed, and the acorn. So, Procrustes offers rest in a bed designed to make you fit his expectations. The hermit offers labor that allows you to stand to your full height. I should be clear, what you've just heard is not a myth in the old cosmological sense. It's a legend filtered through centuries of moral imagination. But its mythic charge is undeniable because it speaks to a process we all recognize. The long, exhausting search for purpose and meaning, and for a place where our true stature is allowed to exist. The summons and the false kings. Offerus begins his journey much like Theseus and each of us. He sets out at the prompting of his acorn, following a silent summons towards a destiny he cannot yet name. He's looking for a place to belong. He does what so many of us do on our own journeys. He mistakes being useful for being seen and welcomed. He assumes that if something is powerful enough to overpower him, a king, a devil, a rigid belief system, or a demanding family, it must be big enough to protect him. He winds up in the service of the wrong kings, not because he's on the wrong path, but as part of the necessary downward growth that must occur before any of us can begin growing up. He has to exhaust every false master and every shadow in before he can recognize the true one. He has to learn by the disappointing evidence of experience that being shaped and used is not the same thing as being redeemed. By redemption, I'm not talking about the religious idea of forgiveness being handed down from elsewhere. I mean the redemption of the road, the reclamation of the path that you've walked and the parts of yourself that have been trimmed so that you can survive it. That shaped self, the trimmed back, trained, wired and stretched versions of ourselves that we become as a result of coercive environments, is not worthless. It's not the shape of a wasted life or ruined potential. It's a carrier. It is the form we take to survive. And in that form, in your form, as controlled, misguided, or manipulated as you might have been, the power of the acorn still lives, as strong as ever. The hermit, the anti-Procrustes. The hermit is a man who lives in the wilderness, beyond the borders of civilized society, beyond the courts and their measures. He keeps a higher law, the law of the divine, which, read through our archetypal lens, means that he serves the deep, archetypal self, the self with a capital S. He doesn't look at Offerus and reach for the tools with which to prune and wire him into an acceptable shape. He doesn't try and fix him. Instead, he offers depth. He looks at the plain fact of Offerus's size, the very thing which marks him as being different in the eyes of other people, and he blesses it. The hermit guides Offerus towards action that aligns his differentness with the pull of his acorn, a form of service that is congruent with both who Offerus is now and who or what he wants to become. Go to the river, he says. Make your strength a shelter. Become the bridge. The weight of wholeness. Finally, we come to the image of the child. Theology aside, in the mythological context, the Christ is a figure of transformation so complete that the usual heroic pattern can't quite hold him. He doesn't merely win a battle, outwit an enemy, or seize a treasure. He transfigures the terms of the struggle itself. He is, in Jungian language, the redemptive power of the transcendent function. The emergence of a third thing when the psyche has been split into opposites and can no longer survive by choosing one side. In this story, that third thing arrives as the child. In writing about the transcendent function, Carl Jung says, "There's nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function. It means a psychological function comparable in its way to a mathematical function of the same name, which is a function of real and imaginary numbers. The psychological transcendent function arises from the union of conscious and unconscious contents." That's in the Collected Works, Volume 8, paragraph 131. In the legend of St. Christopher, that child is the image of the union that Jung is talking about. Offerus doesn't find him in a castle. He doesn't earn him by bowing to an external authority. The child appears when Offerus finally stops auditioning for approval, when he stops letting Procrustean standards dictate his shape, when he finally says, "Fast, pray, I can't do those things," and refuses to cut himself down to fit even the hermit's standards. He meets him when he stops looking for validation or acknowledgement from an external authority. Instead, he remains in the wilderness and begins truly inhabiting his own shape by doing something that only he can really do, by stepping into exactly what makes him so unique. When he finally does this, the acorn's pull and his conscious pursuit of purpose meet at last in the same place. And so, the child appears. Small enough to be dismissed or overlooked, but heavy enough to reveal what Offerus has truly been serving. Whatever Christ means theologically, mythically, he carries a gravity of grace, the strange mercy by which our road can be redeemed. The weight of that Christ child is the weight of wholeness. The bonsai as the carrier self. This episode has turned out much longer than I intended. In writing it, I spent time in deep reflection on my own experiences of belonging, where it fed and nurtured me, and where it cost me parts of myself. I kept it long because the ideas we're circling here need the space to breathe. Shadow inns and Procrustean beds are traumatic experiences, but often the trauma only shows up later. When we're there, when we're in the moment of being measured and mutilated, they don't always feel as bleak and violent as Theseus' story shows them to be. Sometimes, like in the story of Offerus, who became St. Christopher, they feel like having found the most powerful king to serve, a place where our strength is finally recognized. It's only later that we realize, perhaps after years, that the real service we've been performing has been a process of self-refinement geared towards reduction and limitation, a disintegration or dismantling and compartmentalizing of ourselves, rather than growth and integration. Trying to grow in this way, by cutting back parts of your soul and repressing instead of integrating them, is lonely and isolating work. It's almost always accompanied by a burden of loneliness and a sense of isolation, despite the fact that, at least in the community or relationship in which it's taking place, we should feel more connected. Recognizing this usually only happens in hindsight. Personally, I've found strong medicine in these stories for myself, and I wanted to share it with you. The difficulty has been trying to share the images without imposing the limits of my own personal experiences on them. The patterns we've been speaking about in this episode are broad and widespread, but we each experience them in very specific and personal ways. Once we become aware of the ways in which we've experienced them, the shame and guilt, or the fear of being judged and rejected that held us in place while we were subject to the coercive process, comes up again. We blame ourselves for having been so manipulated, contained, and reshaped. When, like with Christopher, clarity dawns, the moment in which the realization that I've wasted my time here arrives, we're confronted with the question of what we really are without the form and structure prescribed by the Shadow Inn. It's both painful and deeply humiliating to feel that the performative bonsai self that brings you praise and acceptance in a coercive environment is not the real shape of who you are. And so, rather than open up and let the light in, we shut the weight of that painful humiliation away. Keep it somewhere dark and secret, because if others saw it, we might be rejected by them too. That's a lot. As Brené Brown has pointed out, shame derives its power from being unspeakable. What makes having fallen victim to coercion so unspeakable is how humiliating it is to admit that we feel manipulated, taken advantage of, fooled. Coercive environments, in whatever context they appear, rely on co-opting our permission, our agreement to accept their invitation, to lie in the beds they provide, and to submit to their measuring and reshaping. To anyone on the outside, it's very difficult to understand what would make a person grant such permission. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't usually think about the mechanics of coercion until we find ourselves a victim of its cruel Procrustean pattern. And when we do, we feel stupid. We feel that if we were fooled, it must be because we are foolish. And if we are foolish, then we must be fools. It is very similar to what people who have been scammed feel like after losing money. There's grief for the loss and shame for our perceived foolishness. And that shame is empowered because nobody wants to advertise their folly. It feels unspeakable, and it thrives in the darkness of that secrecy. This can make it very hard to heal. But if you look at some part of your life and recognize the approved silhouette, the clipped branches, the wired posture, the version of you that learned to fit the bed of the Shadow Inn, remember, the weight of that realization is the weight of the redemptive and regenerative power of your Acorn. The grief beneath the layers of anger and humiliation is the weight of the child on your shoulder as you find yourself midstream, halfway across a raging torrent. And if you feel those things, I want you to know that the bank is near. The only reason you're making this crossing is because this is where your Acorn has led you, past courts and kings, deserts and devils. You are here. This is a moment in which the shape of your soul is making itself known to you. It's an encounter, albeit an uncomfortable one, with the numinous and mysterious essence of who you are. Stay with it. Like Offerus, ask it, how have you, who seemed as light as a feather when I began, now become as heavy as the whole world? And step by slow shuffling step, make your crossing. Don't call yourself weak and throw the weight of your grief off by dismissing it. That grief is the weight of what was trimmed so that you could feel like you belonged. But if it has weight, it means it is not gone. The acorn, your potential, remains. And here's a part that the shame that we feel for allowing ourselves to be so manipulated doesn't really want us to learn. The trimmed and wired bonsai self is not the enemy. It is not a betrayal to despise. It is the carrier self, the form you took to survive the season you were in, and no matter how much was cut back, it kept the acorn alive inside of you, waiting until deeper earth appeared. Christopher can only appear if Offerus first carries the child across the river. Offerus is that bonsai self. The bonsai self is the carrier of the acorn. It carries the acorn through our stay in the shadow inn. So, if you find yourself lodged in the wrong place, whether it's a group, a job, a relationship, or a belief system, the question that matters is it now the work to break the spell and leave like Theseus did? Or is it time to stop auditioning and to begin living your life where you are, in your own shape, like Offerus? Either way, the road is not wasted. Either way, your acorn is not lost. You are not lost. Reflection prompts. So, where do these stories land for you in your own life? How do they speak to you in your experiences of the world and its expectations of what or who you should be? Here are 3 short prompts you can use to reflect on the topics we've discussed today. As always, there are no right or wrong answers. If you'd like a text version to use for your journaling practice, please take a look at the show notes for a link to the expanded transcript on my Substack page, or find the link on my website at www.theinwardsea.com. That's www.theinwardsea.com. Prompt number 1. Check your belonging. This is a quick one. Just go with the first reasonable idea that fits the prompt and explore it. The size of the community isn't important here. Whether we're talking about a workplace, a social circle, a spiritual community, or even smaller groups like families or one-on-one relationships, these dynamics can appear anywhere. Are you ready? All right. Think of a place where you feel that you belong, but only because you edit yourself or allow yourself to be edited in order to fit in. Now, name just one way in which you quietly edit yourself in order to secure your belonging there. This week, choose one small moment to stop editing yourself. Say one honest sentence. Set one gentle boundary. Or admit one uncertainty. Even if you only do it quietly with yourself, without public performance or any kind of announcement, that still counts, because allowing yourself to recognize and name the process is a powerful way of honoring the weight of your acorn. The goal of this prompt is not to say that the space you're thinking of is guilty of coercion and manipulation. It's to allow yourself, as well as others in that space, to show up more authentically and ultimately to create a community in which you can see and be seen by one another and be validated for it. Prompt number 2. One rule to ring them all. In writing, name one seemingly arbitrary rule, spoken or unspoken, that you follow mainly out of fear. Now, try name the fear that motivates you. Perhaps it's a fear of losing approval, a fear of losing access, safety, status, or belonging. What does following this rule cost you? Is it sleep? Is it your voice? Perhaps it's friendships or self-trust. Next time you're confronted with a situation in which that rule is being enacted, just once, try a care-based alternative, something small. If you're in a group, try asking a gentle and polite clarifying question. You might want to brainstorm ideas for what this might be so that you'll be prepared ahead of time when the opportunity presents itself. Or you could try requesting time to think, or give it to yourself by excusing yourself for a restroom break. We're not talking about rules like being on time for meetings or looking left and right before crossing a road here. We're talking about arbitrary rules that perhaps need not be as powerful as they feel in these settings. If you're in a safe, physical environment, and you know that you have a strong support system in a context other than the one in which this rule holds so much authority, try just once to break it in a small way, without an explanation. Although this might feel like rebellion in certain situations, it's more than that. It's asserting your personal agency. If it turns out that the rule is actually important and helpful, you'll discover its purpose safely and be able to follow it in the future with a clear sense of why it is so important. It'll no longer feel arbitrary. If it is arbitrary, however, you'll also gain insight into what its actual purpose beyond what it's supposedly doing. Prompt number 3, a companion for the road. The next time you feel that tug to comply or conform to an arbitrary standard because it feels as though your acceptance is on the line, pause. In that moment, ask yourself, is this drawing me towards personal integrity or towards performance, seeking approval from an external source? Choose one anchoring practice for the next month. Keep it simple. One option could be a daily journal practice, just a 2-minute note in whatever note application you have available on your phone, tablet, or computer. There, you can ask yourself just one simple question. What did I do today to stay true to myself? Another option might be to choose one trusted, safe person outside the system where you feel pressured. You might want to share this episode with them and say, this spoke to me. Can we do little check-ins sometimes just to stay honest with one another? Make sure that you both explicitly agree to keep your conversations judgment-free. It's not a space to try and fix one another, just a place to share and affirm each other's experiences. These check-ins aren't a space to complain or badmouth anyone or any group. It's just to notice the pressure when it shows up and to help one another stay grounded on your respective paths. And that brings us to the end of our journey together today. Thank you so much for walking with me. With stories like these, the commentary is only a lamp that I carry for a little while. It's how I've tried to understand what the images have done for me in my own life, and I offer it in the hope that it sheds some light for you too. But the real medicine isn't in my words. It's in the images of the stories themselves. So if you take nothing else from this episode, if you're not ready to dig too deeply into your own social contexts for now, or you'd rather just breathe and move on, please take the images from these stories with you. The inn, the bed, the river, the child's weight, the staff taking root. Let them work in you at their own pace. These images are the real medicine. If you'd like to stay close to this work, you can find the expanded transcript with additional notes and sources on Substack. That's also where I'll post a text version of today's reflection prompts, behind-the-scenes research, and occasional updates on the projects that weave through this show. I include diagrams and visual aids there too, so if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, check out the show notes for the link. If you found this episode helpful, the simplest way to support it is to share it with one person that might need it. And if you're listening on a podcast platform, to leave a rating or a short review. It genuinely helps others find the work. Lastly, if the images or ideas we've shared here today touched something tender in you, take care with yourself. Drink some water, go for a short walk, or tell a safe person that this episode really hit me. You don't have to explain the whole thing. You're also welcome to reach out to me via my website or Substack, which you can find at www.theinwardsea.com. That's www.theinwardsea.com. Until next time, may you have the wisdom to recognize the beds and kings that would shape you and the courage to walk away. And when leaving isn't yet possible, may you remember your acorn is whole and true. May you feel its blessed weight as you make your crossing until you find deep earth and take root. My name is Dimitri, and you've been listening to The Inward Sea.